from Bennett Parlors here in our fireside chat. Once again, I'm Pastor Chris, joined with Pastor Marcy here at Del Mar Reformed Church. We're glad to have you join us for this little reflection. As you may have seen if you were watching our YouTube channel, this past week we celebrated Children's Sunday. So we had wonderful participation and leadership from our children in worship. Pastor Marcy put together our worship service from many different parts. It was wonderful. If you haven't seen it, I certainly would recommend it to you. But one of the passages that's in the typical cycle of reading for this past week, which we didn't look at, was the reading that we're going to be doing this week. So in case you watch a few other channels or look at different churches, you may have heard this passage preached in a different church service this past week. And it's not that we're waiting to hear from other people so that I can steal their material, but rather because we had Children's Sunday that I wanted to wait a week to do this one. But we're going to be looking at a passage that many of us are familiar with. Even those of us who have just a passing knowledge of the Bible have probably heard before. And this is one of the creation stories from the end of Genesis, well, all of Genesis 1 and the very beginning of Genesis 2. So we're going to be looking at that passage. We'll get to that in just a second. But as a way just to open up our discussion, my opening question is, when during the day do you get the most accomplished? Morning, afternoon, evening, nighttime? What kind of person are you? So, Pastor Marcy, if you had a time where you're typically most productive, when would you say it is?
Yeah, well, I am one of those special snowflakes where I get things. I'm definitely a morning person and I'm a night owl. I'm like an evening person. Really rough time though for me is mid-afternoon. So that 2 to 3 hour, it's like, oh gosh, I kind of hit a wall a little bit. But I would say mornings I enjoy my work, but the evenings I definitely see that my pace picks up. So yeah, definitely not the afternoon though.
When I think of my office hours, I think my most typical productive time in the office is 10 to 1 or 10 to 12:30. So it's that mid-morning to noontime. I think it's after I've kind of collected myself and looked at some things and checked emails, and then I really have time to focus on what's going on. And then the afternoon I tend to kind of pick up different things and work ahead or finish up. But that time, I don't know, mid-morning, I'd say. Sometimes, occasionally, I'd like to get up really early. And on those days, I'm really productive early. But most of the time, I'm a night owl, but I'm not especially productive at night. That's the time I find nice rest, like awake rest, let's say.
Yeah.
Like the time I find quiet and kind of peaceful reflection time, not necessarily activity time. But so we're going to be talking about rest and activity and work and all those good things as we think about the days of creation here in Genesis. So we're going to start off by thinking about the creation story, and then we're going to read the whole creation story all the way through. So the first thing I ask is, what do you know about the creation story? So most of us can probably talk about 7 days of creation. Some of us might get some of the days and what happened on which a little bit mixed up. We're not... With day 3, was that just But then we basically know that the 6th day humankind was created. The 7th day God rested. But then there's a story about Adam being created and then Eve being taken from one of Adam's, a rib being taken from Adam while Adam was sleeping. And then because Adam was lonely, and then now there are 2 people instead of just one. But that's actually Genesis 2. That's a whole separate creation account.
Yeah. 2 creation stories.
And so we know that the Bible was the inspired word of God, but it's really hard to think that the people who eventually recorded these stories meant for them to be the same story, but rather two different reflections on the greater story. They're just very different accounts of what happened, even though the focus tends to be in the same place. How it happens is explained very differently. So we're not going to look at that second creation story. That's in chapter 2, the one that usually we think about Adam and Eve. We're looking at the first creation story, which is the older tradition of the two when we look at kind of scholarship and the threads of when these things were written down. Both, again, certainly God's inspired word, but we just look at the scholarship that tells us that there's different glosses. It's like the gospel accounts when we have two different writers writing about the same things that are happening in the life of Jesus. It's just that these both end up in the same book almost. We kind of think they're from two different traditions. But all to say, all of that aside, we're going to be looking at this first Genesis account, which talks about the creation story, the one of 7 days. Not the Adam falling asleep, rib, Eve created. This one is strictly the 7 days. So we're going to look at that first. So Marcy, I wonder if you could start us off, and I'll try and find a good dividing line that we can each take a turn to read the passages that we have here. Why don't you read up through verse 19, and then I'll take it from there.
Absolutely. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome, and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day.
And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that's upon the face of all the earth, every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. So what repeated words or phrases stick out to you in this passage?
There's a lot of repeated words.
A lot of repetition.
Yeah, a lot of repetition. God said, God spoke. There was morning and there was evening.
Evening and morning.
Evening and morning, sorry.
Right. I was looking at that like,
yeah, there's...
So what constitutes a day? How does that work? I was like, no, that makes sense that the day ends with the break of day, not the evening, right? So
absolutely. That's good. And it was so. Like, God is saying something, it's done. It was so. It's been made. And then something I noticed just maybe in this particular time was the blessing. Like, God is blessing these parts of creation and saying that they're good, and it was good. But then there's also this added piece of blessing to it. And so that I was moved by that. That there's the beginning, in the beginning, its original goodness. There's this blessing. God is blessing and saying that all of creation is really good.
And in some ways too, Marcy, and I didn't really think of it this way until you said it, but there's particular blessings or commissionings too of the animals and the birds and humankind to be fruitful, multiply, and fill, right? Mm-hmm. So the pronouncing it good, sure, but also that other additional kind of, purpose too, right?
Yeah.
Because that happens more than once there too. But you're right, repetition all over the place as we think about it.
Absolutely.
The pattern, God speaks, evening, morning, it's good, repeat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So there's a shift here in day 3 of the creation. The question I ask is, what are the differences in general in days 1 through 2? And then what shift happens in day 3 and forward? So by this I mean, if you look carefully, it's interesting that the first couple days, God kind of, it's almost like when I was a kid, I can remember making like dioramas. The first 2 days, God is making the box and the scenery. And the next few days, God puts all the other stuff in it. So like, we create the sky. Well, first it's light and day, or light and darkness, right? Separates the light from the darkness. And then there's sky and water. And then day 3 is this kind of turning point where the water and earth separate. But then also on day 3, now it's like, okay, we've got the sky and the water and the earth, and now God's like,
what am I going to do now?
So all of a sudden, vegetation on the earth. So we have the setting, days 1, 2, and 3. And then on day 3, we make the earth, and then we put stuff in it. And then day 4, we do stuff in the skies. We got the stars and the moon, the light by day and the light by night. And then we switch to animals in the sea and in the air. And the sixth day we get to earthlings.
Mm.
Well, earth dwellers,
Right.
including humankind
Yeah.
at the end of day 6. So it's like you can almost picture God like creating the scene and then populating it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Setting the stage, and now it's filling it. Yeah.
So a lot of people get caught up in the science of this passage or the lack thereof. They wonder, are these 24-hour days? And do these speak of periods or epochs and all this? We can have those conversations, but that's not where I'm going with this particular conversation. But rather, when you see the pattern of what's happening, the bigger picture is that we see God creating. There's a process of creation in this Creator's hands, right?
Absolutely.
So then, do you see any pattern in kind of how that goes, Marcy? I don't know if you had any particular thought or response to that. Do you see a pattern or ordering of the days?
Well, I see it as, so the first and fourth day are connected because it's about light and, and then the second and fifth day is water. So like separating the waters, but then also filling the waters. And then the third and sixth day is land, creating the vegetation, and then also the earth dwellers.
Right, the earth dwellers, yeah.
Yeah. So there's like this, light, water, land. There's this kind of parallelism.
Yeah.
But, it reads very much like a good poem. Like,
I was just going to say, the Hebrew writer, what you just said, the Hebrew writers are always poetic in ways that we don't understand because we speak English, not Hebrew. But there's like a lot of parallelism and kind of paired. Yeah, you're absolutely. Yeah. I see the same patterns that you're talking about now that you've mentioned them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things I see too. So in seminary, I remember one professor, my theology professor, expressing ex nihilo. That's a Latin meaning out of nothing. So there were different controversies over the years and different not theological, but different faiths or perspectives say that some creator created out of something and made something else. And in Hebrew, Judeo-Christian belief, we believe God created out of nothing. So God didn't take stuff that was already there, make something else. Although, chapter 2, God takes some dust and makes a dust person out of the dust, but we're talking in general. And so we see this pattern, like you're saying, there's this parallelism, but within that, there's void, form, and fullness. So God creates out of nothing and gives form to the void, and then fills it. So within that light, water, land, there's also that kind of forming and populating, right? So there's a lot there in that chapter that speaks to a lot of questions I don't think we always ask of this passage. So often we bring scientific questions to this first chapter of Genesis, and I think we miss the point when we do that. The point is to, like, if we think that God takes our lives and brings form from void and then fills the form, if we think of our lives as kind of God brings a form to it and then fills that form, that's an understanding of how to be a God person,
right?
So like that's truth coming from Genesis 1, right? So, Marcy, what's your first impression of God in these passages?
First impressions,
right?
Yes,
and like, if this is all you knew about God, if all that you knew about God was chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, what do you say about God?
Well, I would say God is definitely creative and creator. there is like this creative piece. I also say that God cares about order. Like God makes out of void and darkness is created world and order and light. And there is, if this is all I knew about God, I would say, I can feel very comfortable because it's been ordered by God. I'd also, and this is maybe a little off the, off color, but this is, I would see God as somewhat distant. Kind of, I'm gonna hover above and do this too. Whereas, we see throughout Scripture, God is very incarnational, and even in Genesis 2, God is making the dirt and, breathing, but this seems more like God in the sky, kind of, I'm going to be creating these things. I'm going to be speaking them into existence. I wouldn't necessarily understand maybe what would a relationship with God look like? What would a relationship with the Creator look like as the created? If this is all that I knew about who God was.
I think of the hymn "In the Garden." And he walks with me and he talks with me, and that's not here.
Yeah.
Right. Later on in the garden.
Oh yeah.
There's
it gets
God
there.
present,
Oh, yeah.
but right here, like you bring up a really good point. Would you call it distance, or like? So when I think of the word holy, I think of it set apart, right? So holiness is set apartness. To you, is it holiness, or is it a feeling of distance?
It'd be holiness. Kind of like this, okay, the Creator has done everything. How could the Creator come to me? Like, what?
Like totally set apart.
Yeah,
this is
totally set apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not worthy, kind of a factor. But that's just if I knew.
Right,
if that's
exactly. Yeah. No, and that's the point of the exercise, right? Just to say, like, what does this tell us about God? Because ultimately this passage, spoiler alert, is about God. We're going to talk about where we come in verse 26 through 28 or whatever, but it is about God, make no mistake. So interesting to think about. This is definitely the big creator God who seems to exist on a different plane of existence as we do, which kind of feels like a holiness. Some people would call it separateness or distance.
Yeah.
And I think that I could see where they were coming from.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily see a separation, but I do see a set apartness here.
Yeah.
But yeah, God is creative. There's a lot. God is just doing all kinds of fun stuff. I just think of like, let's give these plants seeds, so that they can continue to grow, and
like making sea monsters.
Let's play with that. Like,
like what?
I'd like to put a sardine in the ocean, and maybe a humpback whale too. It's just incredible kind of scope about this creativity and the goodness of it all, right?
And that God is definitely for creation, definitely cares about creation, and I see you as good.
So I write to providential, and by that I mean caring for. Yeah. So God provides. So God doesn't make animals and humankind and say like, good luck. God says, first we're going to do vegetation. I'm going to put some sunlight for that to grow, and then curiously the sun comes after the vegetation, so that's interesting. But we won't get into that. But here's some vegetation for all of you to eat, so that you have something and for a place for you to live. The sea monsters, you got water. The birds, you got the air, and so there's like a built-in care of sustenance, of being able to sustain, of God's providence in all of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now we get to the fun stuff here, right? So what does it mean to be made in God's image? So for you, is that more of a physical thing? Is that a spiritual thing? Is that a something else altogether.
Yeah. So growing up, this was always like being made in God's image. That was something that was really comforting for me. And, so like, going through seminary, looking at the Hebrew, Tselem, it literally means phantom, or like, almost like kind of like if you squint at it really hard, you can be like, oh, that's God. And for me, I think that's so beautiful because I think it's a both and. I think it's both physical and spiritual. I think that it could be both, but it's not complete without everyone in it. So me as a white female in 2020 am not the full representation of God's image. And so it's like looking at we're all made in God's image. And I love, I've been reading through, this is Lisa Sharon Harper's The Very Good Gospel, and she explores these different pieces of what, what does God say about God's people in Genesis. And I love that she says, specifically about being made in the image of God, she says, we are not God, but because we bear God's image, we are worthy of human dignity, love, respect, honor, and protection. And so she goes on to say, the homeless man and the president and the family member you've cut off and the best friend all are made in the image of God. And because so are worthy of all these different things.
Yeah, that's good. In a lot of the reading I've been doing, there's a tendency of scholars to like try and over-explain it, I think. Where they say like, well, this has to do with our soul or not our body, but then some like give us like God physical. Some I think come dangerously close to making God into man, humankind, I should say.
Yeah.
So often we think like we got to be careful not to make ourselves into God, but we also need to make sure we don't make God into us. And as the scholars kind of explain it, they're like, oh, God has human characteristics. And I'm like, I don't think that's how it works. Like we might have godly characteristics. We have to figure out what that means. But I don't think we can identify God with human, especially God the Creator. We're always biased because we think of God divinely incarnate, Jesus Christ, who's human. But in this case, we're not necessarily thinking we look like God would,
Yeah, and I also think of it as kind of like a divine representation. Like you represent the divine here on earth.
So that's where I'm going to go with it in the next question that I ask, because the phantom thing, I like with it. Like if you squint a little bit, you can see God. I think people often associate that with we have some holiness in us, or if God was to be physically manifest like Jesus, that's what we would look like. There's some nuance to that, but I want to go with where you're going next. And I think that comes out for me in the question of what's it mean to have dominion over or rule over, which they're kind of tricky ways to explain this, but basically God gives us a purpose to, the NRSV says, subdue creation. So what does it mean to do that? So for me, that goes back to the image of God, and the way I see it as, taking what you said, that all of us represent God. And I think the represent is the key word for me. That the way I see it, being made in the image of God is kind of like being God's ambassador. So that if people were to look at you, they would say, that person represents God. And so we as humankind are supposed to represent God's purposes on earth in the way I read it.
Yeah.
So to subdue the planet makes it sound like God gave it to us. We can use it, stomp on it, whatever we want to do.
Yeah. We have dominion.
We have dominion.
Power, right?
Which there's royal language here. Like,
yeah.
You are the ruler of the world. Yes. But history is littered with good rulers and bad rulers. Bad rulers, like so-and-so the violent, or so-and-so the corrupt, or
You're
whatever.
trying not to use anyone's name from church, right?
But like a ruler called so-and-so the dark, or something like that.
Right.
Their names go down in history as being like, yeah, they definitely ruled with an iron fist. They took advantage. They ruled for their own purposes. And then you have these rulers who go down in history as those who cultivated their people and tried to look out for the least among them, or tried to introduce new systems or things like that. And you have so-and-so the benevolent or something like that. And
right.
and I'm not saying that history gets all these people right. I'm just saying that some rulers come down as rulers. That's their land. They can do what they want with it because they are the ruler. And others see the idea of being a ruler as a responsibility to that which you're ruling, not to lord over it. Yeah.
And I would say that that's it. It's responsibility, and it sounds like a respect. I've been given this task to take care of this as God's representative. I'm here to take care of the earth and those that are filling it. What I wonder is, like, reading this as someone who would have just, first century folk, what would have been like to say, you have dominion, you have power now. But as someone who is lowly, that raises them up in such a way. I mean, like, imagine what if everyone saw that as like every person on this earth has dominion, has power, has authority, has a charge and responsibility and blessing to this particular, to this world. I know for me, that's a humbling thing. Like, oh, that means like I am not the only ruler. There's others, or I'm not the only one who has dominion.
And that you and I are both models of what it looks like, what God looks like in the world.
Yeah.
So that means that it doesn't matter which one is a ruler or lowly in status. Mm-hmm. It also means that if a tomato plant ever knew how to talk, which they don't, but do we treat the creation around us like, are we really God's representatives? Do we use it for resources for gain, financial gain, or are we really using it the way we would be proud to say this is the way God would use this forest and this lake?
This is a great equalizer for people. Everyone's made in God's image. Everyone has these responsibilities.
We are tasked collectively with this, not some of us, right? Yeah. So I mentioned about the Trinity being a part of this. There's a thing that you may have looked at this and seen that there's a collective pronoun here in some of this, that God says, let us make humankind in our image. And people have tried to explain that as, God's talking to the heavenly host, or God's using the royal we, or the Trinity is here. Frankly, I think it's okay to refer to God as plural or singular. I don't think that there's theological significance to that in general. However, from a Christian perspective, we think about the Trinity, and in the Gospel of John, we hear about in the beginning was the Word, and creation is made because God speaks. And so we see pre-incarnate role of Christ here, perhaps. Later in chapter 2, we see God breathe life into humankind. The Holy Spirit is in the Old Testament often associated with God's breath.
Mm.
So there, for a Christian looking back, you can see this kind of creation story. You can see the Godhead as present here in some ways. But we don't need to try and figure out how Jesus relates to this first chapter of Genesis. There's a lot to explore without saying, and because Jesus was there. We can just talk about God in broader terms right here. We don't have to always be talking about the Trinity when we're talking about the Old Testament. Right. We can often figure out how our Christianity helps us to read it or how it helps to inform our Christianity. But here, this is about God's general purpose for us. So, why do you think God rested on the seventh day?
Sabbath. Crown of creation in my mind. This is the cherry on top of creation, is Sabbath. And simply, I think a part of this is to model for us what is a good balance of work and rest. God is not a workaholic. God is not particularly anxious about making sure that God is always at work in order for creation to, be doing okay. God models for us that it's actually really good to step away from work. Granted, of course, that God is with us, and God is, one of my seminary professors used to say, God is like an insomniac, like will not rest until there is justice and shalom in the world. And I also believe that well-being doesn't come from endless work. Being good and being whole, we need breaks. We need rest. Break is probably a wrong word for this, but I think God models for us to not be workaholics and that we need rest. We need time set apart. I mean, that's what makes Sabbath so holy, is that it is time set apart. And that, and I'm not here advocating for, you can't mow your lawn on Sunday, or, you can't turn on, you can't turn on the TV, or you can't really do anything. But I see it as it's good to take time away with God. It's good to rest. It's good to stop.
So, for me, I see it as a culmination. It's kind of the end of one thing and the beginning of another. It's putting a burden down of this thing and completing it. And I'm sure there's other things that could have happened in creation, but God said, it's good. It's very good. So now, I will lay that down.
Yeah.
Because I know there's going to be other things that I'm going to have to do.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
This idea, and I had one scholar, you talked about, not doing things on Sundays. My last church was in a town where people in that church, when they were growing up, their parents would get ticketed if they did laundry on a Sunday. Like the town police would ticket you.
Wow.
Like those were laws. You weren't allowed to do things like that on a Sunday, which is crazy to think about. But it's not crazy for people of a generation older than mine.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, Sabbath is Saturday. It's always been Saturday. Mm-hmm. He said, Sunday's the first day of the week. Christians celebrate the resurrection on the first day of the week, not the Sabbath day.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Sunday is for joyful worship and being a part of something. So he was saying how oftentimes people see God's modeling rest and saying we should not do anything either. But it's an active rest. It is not a cessation of doing things. It's a completion of something. So he argued, if you want to mow your lawn on a Saturday, go ahead. But lay burdens down, complete something before you start something else. And I thought that's a healthy way to understand Sabbath. is to give yourself a break, not a sit and drink lemonade break, but a break of, I'm complete there. I'm not going to tune into the news today. I'm going to take a day of rest from that. Not to block it out or ignore it, but to give myself a chance to re-energize, to produce.
Like, for me, it was like, Sabbath rest is hiking or kayaking. It's getting connected with creation and with the Creator. It's taking that time away to have that. I like that active rest.
An active rest could look like it's activity. It doesn't have to be confined. We're not allowed to leave our yard and things like that. But to make it another day of burden, I think, is the idea that God models for us there. So, my last question, does this passage better answer the who, what, where, when, or why? And what's that tell us about the intent of the passage? So what do you think, Marcy? Out of those, what does it best address?
Oh, gosh. Is there a right answer for this one?
There are some wrong ones.
There are some wrong ones? Okay. I would say that this passage answers who and maybe what. I'd say... Yeah.
That's what I've written down.
Okay, awesome.
I don't think it answers why at all.
Or when.
It certainly does not answer when at all. If anything, it creates a lot more questions about when. It certainly does answer who.
Yeah.
Which is what the point of the passage, I think, is to talk about God and what God's creation. When we try and make this passage tell us the answers to some of those other questions, I think we lose track on where the focus should be. Because we don't need those other questions to have this particular passage just open up all kinds of understanding for us about what it means to be a follower of God and who God is.
Yeah.
What God's purpose is in this particular passage, how that works. So, just an incredible way to start off the Bible. So kudos to you, Bible writers. You got us right in there, but it is what an incredible opening understanding of who God is, the Creator, and to help us kind of get an idea of a purposeful creation and then a purposeful stopping and laying down that burden, that kind of thing. Not a departure from creation, but simply a day of rest. So lots of wonderful things to consider here, lots of things to think about what our purpose is, who we are called to be as representatives, as we have dominion and are called to subdue. What does that really mean? So we thank you for joining us for this discussion again on the first chapter of Genesis and the first story of creation. And we look forward to joining with you again. We'll be meeting again for the next couple weeks for Bible study on Wednesdays. And then our normal practice would be to take a summer break, a hiatus, probably usually around mid-June. But we're going to be doing this through June, and then we'll be taking a break for the summer. So we hope that you'll continue to join us for the next couple weeks as we consider the coming Sunday and the scripture passage we'll be thinking about. So for now, we'll see you again sometime soon. Look forward to joining with you in discussion and reflection again.